Well, great. Well, good morning, everyone. So thrilled to see all of you on the call for this really important update that we have about two topics that we know impact every school district in the state. I'm Matt Hillman. I'm the executive director for the Minnesota Association of School Administrators. And I just want to thank, we have so many panelists. I'm not going to introduce them all right away because I want to make sure that we get as much time for them to talk about the topics as possible. And so we want to thank the members of MASA who have participated in these two really important groups, the Blue Ribbon Commission on Special Education Funding and then the Compensatory Task Force. So we are going to begin with the Special Education Blue Ribbon Commission is my understanding. So I'm going to turn it over to Marcy and Stacy and Dan to give those updates.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to have you here. My name is Stacy Stanley. I am a proud superintendent, St. Paul Public Schools, and I'll let my other colleagues introduce themselves.
Good morning, I'm Marcy Dowd. I'm the superintendent for Intermediate District 287.
I'm Dan Armagas. I'm the executive director for SMEC.
Yeah, and so we've had the opportunity to sit on Blue Ribbon Commission along with former colleague Corey McIntyre, who at that time was superintendent of Anoka Hennepin. Started last October, met in a variety of meetings, both as whole group, small group. And so we're just going to go over that information with you today. Just as a reminder, we want to let you know that Blue Ribbon Commission came out of legislation at the very end of let's see, 2024 session, and said that MDE would convene a Blue Ribbon Commission on special education. The purpose of the commission is to develop and present to the legislature a plan for transforming special education services while maintaining that free and appropriate public education for students with disabilities. As we mentioned, there were a host of individuals. It was application process, and so all of us applied to be on the commission, and a very diverse representation in roles that sat on there. At Minnesota, as you can see, was represented. Pacer was there. As I said, several superintendents, executive directors over school districts, Autism Network. We were really pleased with just the diversity of the representation of voice on the committee. Now we'll get to the main thing that was the difficult thing. Our task was to cut $250 million in special education budget. And we all know that that was incredibly difficult because we have maintenance of effort. And so we couldn't just go in and cut our budgets because we know that federal, that would not work. And so it was a difficult task, and we're here to let you know where we landed as a committee. So we had 5 goals. I won't read all of those goals to you, but I will go over them and summarize them. Increase efficiencies. Look for ways to provide service basically in a more financially reasonable way, reduce the expenditures, increase access, and reduce paperwork. We know that we have been hearing from our staff for decades now that the paperwork is too much. And we also know that in Minnesota, we have greater requirements than that are above and beyond federal requirements. Reform special education funding formulas to incentivize efficient, inclusive practices and to slow the cost growth in special education services. So we did have several subcommittees, as I mentioned, that worked on specific goals. So both Marcy and Dan, they broke into the special education finance subgroups. I worked on the special education implementation subgroups. And so each one of us will just give you some background. Marcy's going to kick us off around the finance piece of it. This just gives you a look at really where each one of us was assigned.
All right. So as we looked at our recommendations, the biggest consideration we had was IDEA, FAPE, maintenance of effort. And so the committee looked and prioritized things that were part of the special ed state funding formula that actually funded general education programs versus special education programs, knowing that these were our guardrails in the reductions. As Dr. Stanley shared, the reductions were hard. $250 million impacts everyone. And so what we really talked about is we do not want the cross subsidy to be reduced. And so we needed to look at other ways to meet that $250 million level. So after the financial subgroup met, we really came up with 4 buckets: transportation, alternative delivery of specialized services or ADSES. There's a hold harmless component to the current formula, and then we talked about tuition billing. So these were the 4 actually consistent. The finance groups were pretty consistent in what they recommended in these buckets, and it was anywhere from complete elimination to either partial elimination or sunsetting. So we had the whole gamut of options within these areas. So if we go to the next slide, if we just look at transportation, Paul Farron presented, after we gave our recommendations, he did finances around it. Now, mind you, these are estimates, but estimating all the way from removal. So FIN 28, if you're not familiar with that, that's special, it's transportation for care and treatment, homelessness, section 504. And when we say FIN 23, that's a UFARS finance code 723 for special transportation. So this is what we considered and the costing for the biennium. On the next slide, we talked about ADSES. Again, you'll see a total elimination to a shift to a per pupil allocation. So the second one is a per pupil allocation that all school districts and charter schools would get. Right now, you have to apply for ADSES, and not every district has applied. So this would be a funding formula going right to school districts and charter schools. Paul used a 10% enrollment, thinking 10% of your students might need intervention, and ADSES is really to intervene before qualifying for special education. So you take that 10% of enrollment, you do $500 per pupil with every district, traditional charter or traditional school district and charter school getting a minimum of 20,000 to a maximum of $500,000. And then we had another example of removing ADSES from the funding formula and creating a separate with a capped proration. So these were some options. The next one is hold harmless. As you know, in 2016, when the formula changed, we had a cap, which was removed, and we also had a hold harmless. The hold harmless is a way to support districts as they transition to the new funding formula. There's less than 50 districts still getting hold harmless aid, meaning you get no less than what you got in 2016. So it would be, we're 10 years into the funding formula, so it would be removing that immediately or sunsetting it was one of the options. And then the last one was tuition billing. Really, right now, charter schools get 100% of their unreimbursed portion of special education reimbursed, either from member or from resident districts, and the state covers 10% of the charter school unreimbursement. So we were recommending removing the state's portion. That means that charter schools would have unreimbursed cost as part of the tuition billing. We also talked about eliminating the general ed billing. So through intermediate school districts and other district cooperatives, and when we need to bill back our member districts, we're billing back the general ed aid and unreimbursed portion of special ed, and there's a cross subsidy aid. Now that we have a cross subsidy, there's a cross subsidy aid that's part of it. So those were a couple options we looked at. Stacey, I'll let you do this one.
All right. So there were other areas that we wanted to look at that could help with savings, but we knew that these savings were going to be long-term. Remember, we had to come up with a recommendation within a year, and we know that any changes to efficiencies are going to take at least 5 years to make a difference. And so we did look at several. We wanted to reduce and simplify special education paperwork, as I talked about earlier. We want to continue to increase and expand teacher prep for special education. We know that we're all, hustling to find teachers right now. We definitely want to increase LEA and interagency collaboration. So I'll give you an example of that. Some conversations that came up in the small groups were how might we collaborate around the use of speech pathologists, for instance. How might we collaborate around the use of OTs or PTs or something like that? Really work on early identification and related services, and those models require all LEAs, charter schools, and cooperatives to third-party bill. There's an estimate that, well, we have millions of dollars that are left on the table with third-party billing across the state. Take a look at the legal and administrative costs that are required, and maybe have a special committee to work on that. Review FAPE for non-public schools, because all of us are providing services to the non-pubs in the districts that are in the districts where we serve. Address charter school tuition billing rates. Again, that is addressed within the finance side. Really hone in and focus on MTSS, that we want MDE to continue to support that. We know that there's actually legislation that says that we have to have something in place very shortly, but that there would continue to be an investment in that. Reevaluate entrance criteria for special education, and then address healthcare affordability and access.
So here's where we landed. We did a majority voting on August 6th. And if you go to the next slide, here are the items that make up the 255, or it's estimated, so about $250 million. But what we did agree to is establish a separate FIN 728, so that's transportation for homeless care and treatment, section 504. We would take 60 million out of the state funding formula and have its own allocation. So that's an annual, and it's capped at 60 million. So at the 60 million, it would be a reimbursement around 60% with clear statewide eligibility guidance and increased MDE oversight of contracts for transportation was part of the conversation. Now, with a cap, just to acknowledge that if transportation costs go up, that reimbursement probably will go down. The second one was a shift to ADSIS. So we all agreed that all districts would get, and charter schools would get ADSIS funding as an intervention stream. It is based on that 500 per pupil with a min of 20,000 and a max of 500,000. We heard from many districts regarding the removal of ADSIS and how critical it was to them. So we also, heard that we'd rather have you address transportation than take away ADSIS. So this was a compromise between the two. So it'd be all school districts would get ADSIS. So if you are a district that's not getting ADSIS right now, that would be a funding stream coming to you. We would eliminate the charter school tuition billing aid that the state currently covers. So charter schools will now have a 10% of their unreimbursed portion of special education as part of their cross subsidy. And we would eliminate the hold harmless funding. So that is, and these are just estimates, but it's around the 250 million.
Yeah, we heard loud and clear from our colleagues across the state on all of these areas, and we know that there will be an impact in every one of our districts. We know that our greater Minnesota colleagues, because we heard loud and clear from them as well, that oftentimes you're relying, if you have the ADSIS dollars, those are your dollars for the READ Act. And so we knew eliminating that would not be a wise decision. So hopefully that will allow districts to continue to have those funds. We also heard from Greater Minnesota, and we do understand that in Greater Minnesota, there are students who are homeless and are served through McKinney-Vento, and that truly helps to support your budgets as well. And so really work to maintain as much of those dollars as we possibly could, while not, impacting districts. Reality is, what we did know is that if we did not come up with an option that would have the least impact across our state, across districts, across our state, that those monies were going to come out of the cross subsidy. And that would have had a greater impact on every one of our districts. So that's why we landed here.
The other thing
Yeah.
that we took into consideration too is the maintenance of effort. When you look at the cuts from the 728 and the ADSES, it doesn't affect the maintenance of effort. Those are non-special ed costs included on the special ed formula. So in order to avoid the maintenance of effort issue, those were two of the top priorities. And we also looked at ADSES as being one that's affecting rural districts more than the metro, why the 728 was affecting metro more than the rural districts. So by doing them in combination, it really shared the pain across the state.
Yeah.
I, this is
And so,
um uh this is Jeff Reidelhuber joining from my telephone, so apologize if you're not seeing my name on there. I want to thank this committee. I know that the job was incredibly challenging, um, and I think that you were boxed in to a great extent before the process even started. With that being said, I do appreciate the recommendations, and I think that we'll all agree that impacting the cross subsidy on special ed would be catastrophic. I also want to share, and I want to thank you for acknowledging the impact on ADSIS. I can tell you that for my district in Rockford, this is a major hit, and I'm talking about a hit of almost $700,000. That is something we won't be able to recoup, even with the 10%. It will create substantial cuts to our system, to our most vulnerable population, and it's really it's not unexpected because this is where I figured the cuts would come from. But I thought that I didn't know they'd be this significant. Again, I don't blame the committee at all because I think that you were again challenged with what you could do and what was possible. I guess my ask of everyone on this call is even with these recommendations again, which were anticipated, I would advocate that immediately at the outset of the legislative session, we lobby incredibly hard to repeal the $250 or $250 million cut to special ed so that these recommendations don't actually happen. And that this is going to have to happen really fast because, generally ADSIS applications are due, you know, starting in February of the cycle. And so I really want to stress that uh, while I think that the community did everything they could to help as many districts as possible, this is incredibly painful and it's probably going to, have us cut a lot of staff. So thank you.
When you look at it, that was our representatives that were on the committee already started that process. Even this legislative session, they had House File 4114, and that was specifically to repeal this. And I would assume that they're moving forward with that into the next session too. But that was one of the things they were working on at the same time that we were working on these cuts. It was putting together a bill to repeal that.
Yeah, and Jeff, honestly, in our recommendation, we state clearly that we do want to repeal this, that we were placed in the position where we had to come up with this, but our preference is that we repeal this. And I agree with you. I think it is early and often. I think we have to start talking with our legislators now, even, and not wait until the session starts so that we can help them understand. Being able, I mean, I'm just looking at the comments. I'm losing 800,000. I'm losing 700,000. I'm losing 400,000. And again, these are our districts in greater Minnesota where their budgets are incredibly tight. Everyone's is, and they are all the more tight in greater Minnesota. And so, absolutely, start talking with your legislators now, not even waiting to help them explain what would happen. But we did very explicitly state that we want the $250 million required reduction repealed in the recommendation that we are submitting.
Yeah, and I just want to share again, Jeff, you were right. We sat as a committee and said, who do we impact? Students that are homeless or special education? I mean, or kids that are vulnerable and needing support. I mean, we were in a no-win situation and pitting some of our most marginalized students against each other in these. So it's a cut to everybody. It was awful. Just going to say it was the committee did a great job given what we had to do, but it was an awful and hard conversation.
Yeah.
I just want to emphasize too that Valerie Dosland, our lobbyist, is on the call, so she's hearing all the things that you're saying. And we currently have our legislative priorities survey open. So I'm hoping that you fill this out and make sure that you put this in. It's obviously going to be a focal point for MASA's legislative advocacy, but it's even better when we can say when we're lobbying that this many hundred people, right, put this as part of what was really meaningful to them. So I want to emphasize, I appreciate what the committee did. Again, we were going to have this cut either way, right? If they didn't have the recommendations, there was a $250 million cut to the cross subsidy. No win is the appropriate way to say this. And I thank all of the MASA members and of course the other people on the committee who really leaned in to try to make this the least worst that it could be given all the circumstances. So again, please make sure you complete that legislative priority survey. And I'm going to just, Valerie's on the call. And when you're out talking with people who are running for office, right, because this is an election year for all state senators, all state house people, make sure you're asking them these questions and getting it on their radar. What is their response to this when we ask? So again, thanks to everybody who has participated in this. I just wanted to make sure people knew that we were on it.
Is this the time we can ask questions? Okay. Some Superintendent Pequot Lakes, just to thank you for all of your work and your time. I guess I'm going to go back to the access point. It's my understanding that access, the cap is the same for all school districts, no matter if you're a school district of 20,000 students or 100 students, which I get inherently benefits smaller districts because the cap is the same for all districts, which I think people could see that as inequitable. But you look at all the other funding sources of QComp, which school districts like mine can't access. And there's nobody who's on the other side who's advocating for us to access that. Or you look at free and reduced, where a kid in one district is worth more than a kid in another district. So there's all these inequities across our state in the funding, which disadvantages a portion of our districts a lot more than other. And so I would just like to know the committee's rationale, not just lowering access, which I can understand, but not just lowering it, but then changing the rules and making it more equitable when we have all these other funding formulas that are inequitable and inherently creating a very distinct winners and losers in this formula by not just lowering the cap down to pick a number, but changing the rules and creating more winners and losers.
So I'll just start. That was not our intent to create more winners and losers. And so I get the energy around ADSIS, and we wrestled with it too. What we saw was that, yes, not every district has applied to access ADSIS, which currently has a cap no matter what size you are. So the cap is not different in the sense there's a cap. The amount is different. But what we saw in the data was each year school districts were applying for ADSIS to the point where we're almost getting all of the school districts now applying for ADSIS because of the need of funding in this area. So we went from very few districts accessing ADSIS to now we're getting the majority. And that was evidence of data that we used to decide that.
And once you make the cuts, if we took the cut in cross subsidy, the first thing that the districts are going to do is apply to ADSES to offset those cuts. ADSES was going to grow no matter what. The other thing that we looked at is the districts that are going to lose their cross subsidies if we didn't address ADSES shouldn't be using their cross subsidies to subsidize the districts that have ADSES. So we had to make a cut there. And again, if you make that 250 million cut straight from the cross subsidies, we're going to offset our costs by going out for that ADSES grant. The other thing that we looked at too is when you looked at it, I didn't want to put a cap and say, okay, only the districts that currently have it get it now. That is a funding source that should be available to everybody. If it's going to be to some, it should be available to everybody there. I think there's more inequities if you shut it off and say no one else can apply here. So uh, it was an all or nothing. A lot of the districts said they wanted more of a step down approach, and this was kind of the best way to do that, but still give accessibility, access to other districts.
Yeah. And I think, what it comes down to is there were two funding sources, once again, that were being paid out of special education, only two funding sources that are not truly special education expenses, complete special education expenses. And those were the McKinney-Vento homeless transportation and ADSIS. Once again, we have to meet maintenance of effort. And so there was no way that we were going to be able to take and reduce $250 million out of special education. Legally, we literally couldn't do that. And so, as Marcy and Dan have shared, the reality is, for everyone on the call, there was no win-win situation. It is quite honestly a loss for everyone, and we know it's incredibly substantial loss. I know that I've heard from colleagues after we presented at AMSD that some of these cuts may send them closer into statutory operating debt because they have very low fund balances. And that's why we have to get out and talk to our legislators. We have to have a concerted effort to start doing that now and helping them understand what the bottom line impact is for our children, for the just the overall financial health for each of our districts.
Yeah, just to add, Melissa, I saw your comment in there. It was not. I wish it would have been more equitable if we would have just done the cross subsidy. So we did look at that too. And although Stacy, Dan, and I are here presenting, we are not, it was a committee decision making. So there were multiple voices in the space. And so there was no good scenario. So I don't know what else to say about it.
Well, and I don't agree with the cross subsidy because then you're taking the funding that was allocated for students with special needs and you're taking that away and you're funding non-special ed programs such as your ADSES and your 728. The cross subsidy is also a funding source that continues to grow, where your ADSES and the 728 or I mean, the cross subsidy is another growing factor there. So again, really didn't want to touch that one.
There's a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate that ADSIS reporting requirements would change if this recommendation were to go through?
Well, the recommendation as it stands now is that it's flowing to you, so there shouldn't be an application process. But MDE made it very clear that they'd like some type of reporting process of usage and outcomes. And then I saw, Kevin, you had a question. The reduction of paperwork will show some other reductions we talked about, but anything, we kind of broke them into, here's reductions that could happen in the biennium to meet the 250 million. And then there's other reductions that were hard to quantify. Plus, we knew that if you change paperwork recommendations, you are changing Minnesota rule. And that can't occur within the biennium to change the rule and the outcome. So we know that could be why it was part of like the long-term goals, was because we still want to go after it. However, it could take 3 to 5 years before we see any kind of fiscal reduction and or staffing reduction to support paperwork. And so we had to break it out to what could be cut within the biennium and what are some long-term recommendations that may take rule change that won't be able to happen within the biennium and therefore couldn't meet the $250 million.
The fast turnaround and the 250 million cut limited the options. And when you look at that fast turnaround, you're really looking at your ad sets, your 728 or your cross subsidy.
Yeah, I want to just step in here, and I just want us all to give these presenters a virtual round of applause because they have done really great work in a very difficult circumstance. And what I want people to know is that we're hearing your concerns, and we'll capture the questions that were in the chat. If you have additional questions about this, please feel free to send them to Lori Zimmerman and I. We can help work with folks to create an FAQ about this so that people get similar information. We do have another important topic about the compensatory task force, and I know people, as a recently recovering superintendent, I know many people probably have backed this up with something at 10 o'clock. So we want to make sure that we have a chance for our compensatory presenters to talk as well. But I just want to personally thank Marcy, Stacy, and Dan. You are the messengers of this. I think that you represented our members and our students incredibly well, given the really difficult choices that were there. We're proud of you. We're proud of the work that you did. And we support your effort and know that we're going to be all in on advocating for repeal. So again, let's thank them all. And we're going to shift to our discussion about the compensatory task force. And we've got several presenters today, and we want to welcome Kent, Matt, and Zena, who are going to talk about that.
Thanks, Matt. And I echo my thanks to the Blue Ribbon folks. I'm Kent Packel. I'm superintendent in Rochester, and I will let Zena and Matt introduce themselves if they want to come off, and then I'll quickly kick us off.
Morning, I'm Zena Stenvik, superintendent in Columbia Heights Public Schools.
And we're pretty sure Matt is out there. Well, we'll hope he'll jump in by the time we get to his slides. Actually, if not, Zena and I will wing it. Let me just hit a few kind of really important points. We are pretty far in our process, but not all the way done. We have taken a vote, and all of the recommendations we're going to share with you passed initially, but we have not seen a cumulative run from the Department of Education of what the combined recommendations would do for compensatory revenue funding. We earlier in our process saw runs for various components of the recommendation, but what you're going to see is that this is a very complex set of recommendations. And so we have not seen the combined impact on individual districts or charter schools. And really importantly, we've not seen the combined impact on the total amount of revenue that is taken to meet the needs of kids living in poverty in Minnesota. Compensatory revenue is about $900 million right now. As you'll see, we're recommending adding ways to find kids who live in poverty. And so our projection as task force members is that it will be a few $100 million more to really meet the needs of kids living in poverty, because we're going to count them better. Whether the legislature will fund it, especially coming off the discussion we just had about the Blue Ribbon 250 million, is a huge question. But it's important for you to know that we have not yet seen those final runs, and so that's going to be really important. Candidly, I'm not sure the department is going to give them to us before we have our final vote. I certainly hope so. I sent a long email to the task force and MDE on that this morning. One other point, conceptually, we agreed that compensatory revenue is potentially at risk, maybe not next year, but down the road. It's not hard to see someone proposing it as a voucher funding stream. And so we agreed as a task force that we need a really solid formula that makes sense, and we need to make sure that we are using the dollars well. And final point is that currently, with Minnesota having free breakfast and lunch, there's no use of the free and reduced price lunch forms in current law. It will only be based on direct certification, meaning the percentage of kids in your district who get various forms of public assistance. So if nothing changes, that will be the only measure right now. Okay, with that, I'll be really quick on my slides. Final point, there's a lot of text on these slides, so you can go deep into our recommendations. We're not going to read them all to you. There's our charge to look at very specific aspects of compensatory revenue, and we're going to try and walk you really quickly through our recommendations for each of those. Next slide. And there you can see the specific issues that we were charged with the legislature to examine. I think we have robust recommendations for most of them, and a couple we have a recommendation to not change anything. And I'll talk about those at the end. Next. We have a preliminary report that we sent in that really just described our process, and then the final report is due in October. I think, like Dr. Stanley was saying about the Blue Ribbon Commission, we had a lot of good folks having difficult discussions. And so it's one of those things that shows, a lot of us can say that task forces are not necessarily solutions, but I think we came to some recommendations that in concept we're supportive of. The devil's in the details, though. Next slide for me. All right. And so I'm going to turn it over then to Zena.
Let's see, is Matt on the Zoom?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay,
Okay,
great.
there you go. Great. Hi, Matt.
Hi, everybody. I think the slides that I'm going to talk about really get at two questions that are related. Who is compensatory revenue intended to help, and how can we count those really well? And so 1 and 2 are sort of put together, and you may not be aware that compensatory revenue in law doesn't say this money is for children in poverty. It says it's intended for students that are experiencing or underprepared to learn. And so one of the first things we needed to do is to determine whether poverty was still the best proxy to use for identifying kids that qualified for the revenue. And we had some discussions about different ways to measure this or different proxies. We talked about looking at academic performance, and that came with its own set of issues. Poverty has been the proxy, obviously, for a long time. And after discussions, we agreed that it should continue to be the proxy for how we're identifying the students that generate the revenue. We know that poverty isn't perfect, and not all kids in poverty are underprepared to learn. That would be pretty deterministic. But in terms of predictability and consistency, and based on what we know from research and experience, it's the best measure that we could determine. So we agreed to leave that there. The second component then that ties into this is how do we go about identifying the students that are in poverty? And so we know that the benefits of compensatory revenue will often trickle over to students that don't necessarily generate the dollars. I think that's important to acknowledge, and that's okay. We all have students that are benefiting from smaller class sizes if we're using revenue to use it for that. And to Kent's point, this revenue is really, really important. And talking about how we're revising or making recommendations about the formula in no way can be interpreted as, this formula or this revenue should be at risk. So looking then at, how do we go about counting kids? Minnesota obviously has had a lot of disruption in terms of how we're counting children that are, I think you can go to the next slide, how we're counting children that are, that qualify for this revenue. We went from children that were generating revenue based on forms and forms only. We talked about or have made changes about direct certification. There was a time in there where it was both. The universal meals law obviously changed the dynamic, and like Kent said, we're in a place now where it's direct certification only. And so we had a real meaningful conversation with business officials that where business officials shared how districts were using this revenue. And I think that was very enlightening to members of the committee and those that were watching, especially those that aren't in the trenches, because I think it drew somewhat of a difference or distinction between how districts are actually having to use the revenue and maybe what theoretically and in a perfect world that it was used for. So after looking at this, if you look at slide 7, our recommendation is to use multiple measures because the goal should be to count all the kids that are eligible. And this is where it gets challenging because I think as superintendents, one of the things we want to know, and Kent referenced this, and it came out of our last call or messages too. We want to know how it affects our district. How is this going to affect me and my district, and what's the implications? And that's really important. And at the same time, what our committee's charge was to put together a formula that works better, is more sustainable, that counts more kids. And so I, for one, am sort of glad that I didn't know how this was going to affect Grand Rapids as we're going through this, even though I want to know. I'm glad I don't know that right now because my focus needs to be on what's the best way for this to work and how do we count the most kids. That should be something that we all should be agreeing on, that we should be as accurate as we can be. And I think we've seen with the shifts that we haven't, whether we're using forms only or direct cert only, we were missing kids. And so our short-term recommendation is to use direct certification, continue to do that, but also to use educational benefit forms, which we need to collect anyway, as Kent mentioned in the comments, as well as Sunbucks, which is a food program for summer. And we believe that would be a good way to make sure we're counting more kids. And then also to use a 4-year average to decrease annual variability. There are benefits to that and implications to that. If you had a big swing in 1 year of kids, your revenue wouldn't recognize that right away. It would take some time. So there's a good and bad to that. The other thing we recommended or are recommending, at least at this point, and as we head towards October, is long-term to add income tax data to this calculation. And we spent some time with individuals from New Mexico, their Department of Education, and they have 3 sweeps that come through their data. One sweep is income tax data, one sweep is direct certification, and their third one is based on census tract data. And they, in their state, even though they have way fewer kids than us, they are doing a really good job of counting almost all the kids that should be eligible. And again, I think personally that should be the goal, to count every kid that is or should be eligible for this. The consequence, and Kent mentioned this too, there's no way that we can count more kids and not have it cost the same or not have it cost more. And so if the state doesn't distribute more money, there will be another redistribution of compensatory revenue if the funding is kept flat. And that inherently means that there'll be another set of winners and losers for the third time in 4 years or whatever. And so I think that's a consequence of a shift like this. We don't know what the implications of that, what those implications are, like Kent said, unless the states were to increase the amount of money that they were putting into compensatory revenue. Let's see, next slide. This is a slide that talks about the rationale. We think income tax data would be helpful because it's focused more on Minnesota. When we're relying on federal programs or federal counts with as variable as they've been, think about Medicare, Medicaid, as variable as that funding is and vulnerable as it is, using federal indicators like that to drive state funding isn't something that our committee was super excited about. And so we felt like the more we could be relying on data that we have in our state, the better. So that's part of why some of these changes were reflected in the recommendations. Next slide then. We talked about how to address when there were big waves of students that would come in and how that would interface with the rolling average. We think that the order, like I mentioned with New Mexico, it's income tax data first, then it's direct cert, then it's census tract. The waves in which those are collected matter. In our state, when we met with the Department of Revenue about the income tax option, I know that's something that's been brought up a bunch by superintendents across the state. I think it seemed like from a technical standpoint, sharing the data is possible. outside of the Department of Revenue, but they said right now that doesn't happen outside of the Department of Revenue, and there are some significant cultural impacts or implications or adjustments that people would have to overcome to get used to the idea of income tax data not being siloed in the Department of Revenue. So it was more about the cultural implications and technical ones. You can read the other considerations that were considered and discussed and that will be documented in the final report on this slide. Once we determined who should generate the revenue and how it should go out, the next thing was about where districts should be allowed to use those dollars, and that's the next slide, and I think Zena.
Thanks. So area number 4 is really looking at how districts spend compensatory revenue, knowing that the dollars are generated by each school site. And the committee found that it varies across the state. My district, for example, nearly 100% of the dollars generated are used at the school site. But we learned that that's not always easy depending on the different context for each district. So the committee again, with many of these areas, we have a short-term plan and a long-term plan for the legislature. So looking at school districts spending 70% of compensatory revenue at the site where it's generated, and then that's allowing for 30% of flexibility. The subcommittee that worked on this area also talked about working with MDE because we know they'll want compliance reporting for that flexibility. So looking down the road for that. And so if you click one more time, the green check marks indicate 100% unanimous voting just as we go through. So here is the deeper rationale that you all can go through. We really wanted to provide the recommendations, the rationale, and then additional considerations for the legislature as they're going through and looking. So some of these things have already been stated. So let's take a look at number 5, area number 5. Concentration factor. This is the only area where there was not 100% unanimous consensus on the committee or on the task force. It did pass the committee to go into the next round for final voting. But concentration is really looking at the concentration factor of poverty within each school. And we looked at a lot of data, and really when you look across the entire state of Minnesota, the majority of schools have a poverty rate between 20 and 40%. That's most schools. And so we looked at we all know that when there's higher concentrations of poverty, 80%, 90%, 100% of poverty, that the schools need additional resources, right? And so we looked at and had discussed at great length, should we go all the way up to 100% with this concentration factor formula? I really appreciate the subcommittee that worked on this one because it's very complicated formulas that they were working with. And some people on the committee or on the task force wanted the concentration factor to go all the way up to 100 schools with 100% poverty, which really aren't that many. We landed on 80% or a 0.8 concentration factor. And really the rationale, there's a few different rationales, but one is if we were to go all the way up to 100%, we're looking at an additional, I think it was $2 to $3 billion. And we all know that the legislature just will not pass that. So we're trying to deliver a report to the legislature that's palatable and that's passable for all of us. So we're doing the most good for the most people, knowing that we had to make some compromises somewhere. So we landed at 80% or 0.8 of the concentration factor. And that, if you click, that passed with 77% of task force voting. So let's take a look at number 6. Number 6 is extended time revenue. The task force is recommending no changes to this area. There were really no arguments or problems with the out of school time or after school portion of the funding. As we went around, just as a reminder, we surveyed across the state, had really robust participation in the survey, and sought a lot of different viewpoints on these areas. So this one was just, why fix a problem that really doesn't exist? So we're recommending it stays the same. So, and 100% of the committee or task force voted for that. So let's go to number 7 with Kent.
Thank you, Zena. We had quite a bit of discussion, and our charge from the legislature asked us if we should make changes in the allowable uses, and ultimately we did not recommend that because the current set of uses allows most districts and charter schools to fund the things that they think are going to impact kids who are, as Matt said, unprepared to learn or who live in poverty. So no recommended changes there. We'll go to the next one. You can read that one. I'll just, in the interest of time, I'll jump to the next recommendation. That one passed. We did want to have some level of greater transparency for the use of compensatory revenue because, as I said at the outset, our task force agreed that we can envision scenarios. I mentioned vouchers, but there was a recommendation on the task force to basically put compensatory revenue on the general education formula. So essentially to get rid of what we think of as a dedicated funding stream. And that took some conversation. So we said part of preserving these dollars in Minnesota is being able to show the public how we're using it. So we are recommending that there be in your comprehensive achievement and civic readiness, increasingly known as CACR, the worst acronym ever, a description of how each district is using its compensatory revenue. But we really want to make sure that that is a not too burdensome reporting requirement. Next. And you can take a look at that one as you're moving on, passed unanimously. In terms of the effectiveness, we ultimately are not recommending a robust evaluation mechanism. And that is partly because it's methodologically very difficult to track one specific funding stream's impact on, for instance, test scores or graduation rates. The second reason is we did not want to spend these scarce dollars on evaluation or monitoring. We wanted to preserve the dollars for programming. So we kind of agreed we'd love it if there was a robust study of the impact that compensatory revenue has, but we're not recommending that dollars be dedicated to that right now. And let's go to the next. And as I said at the outset, we did our preliminary report and we have got our task force coming up. And I know I speak for Matt when I thank Zena for taking the lift on putting together these slides. So thank you, Zena. And if there are any questions or comments, or turn it back to Matt Hillman.
Yeah, let's again give a big round of applause for our compensatory task force members. Obviously, some really important work happening, and as you can see, a complex topic, a lot of deep thought. There were a few questions in the chat that both Kent and Zena had provided some responses to. Again, we can work on putting together an FAQ, but we have a few minutes if people have questions for the compensatory task force members.
Yeah, I see Keith's point. We're very strongly hoping that the adding back the form will have momentum. I think, and this is just my summation, if someone forced us to choose between the measures that we've recommended, the three, there's direct certification we've recommended, bring back the form, and then Sunbucks. And there's a lot of opportunity. We have a member of the task force who works in the hunger field. Like, it's an awkward way to describe it, but that's kind of there. And this is basically money in the summer to help low-income families feed their kids. And she made a compelling case that when you start the school year, to get families to sign your form, tell them that this is automatically going to qualify them for Sunbucks in the summer. And even though it's months and months later, it's a very tangible benefit, because now that in Minnesota we have free breakfast and lunch, the incentive to sign the form is not as great. And she said, you guys should be leveraging Sunbucks like crazy as a way to get people to sign the form, because we know, and Zena talked about this a lot in her district. In Rochester, most of our families apply for public assistance, but there are some districts where there's large numbers of families living in poverty who don't. And so getting the form back is just critical, and Sunbucks is a great lever. I think if we had to choose between Sunbucks and the form, we would vote for the form. We're hoping for all three, but we knew how important it is to get the form back into the formula.
Yeah, I want to emphasize Sunbucks is something that many people, I didn't know anything about it, and I know many of my colleagues who are really paying attention. We didn't know a tremendous amount about. So I think it's something that is worthwhile for you to look into in your district because it really does provide a tangible benefit for families and would be a carrot to be able to get them to do the pieces that are necessary to both qualify for that, then hopefully the benefit of also impacting compensatory. So thanks for bringing those things forward. Other questions for our esteemed panelists here?
Sounds like we must have done at least a sufficient enough job to, or everybody's so depressed that they.
Well, I know that people appreciate the work that our members did on both of these really important committees. And of course, like any issue that's before us, there are things that we are thrilled with and things that we're not. And in this case, it's probably far fewer things that we're thrilled with than not, but it's about being engaged. So appreciate people joining the call today.
I do see a
Alexis,
question up there,
yep,
Matt. Wait, you got it.
Yep, Alexis, go ahead.
Okay, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I'm driving, but I'll go ahead and put a question in. I was just wondering about the evaluation piece, if you can say more about that. I know that there's a part of the compensatory policy language that speaks to the effectiveness of the interventions or something to that effect. Can you say more about the committees or the task force position on that in terms of the evaluation piece and the programming? I'm just looking for a little more clarity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can take that one. I was on that subcommittee. We looked at the 2020 report that came out of the Office of the Legislator Auditor, and and along with our own discussions, there's really no great way to accurately measure a preventative program. I think Matt Gross talked about it. Is how do you measure seatbelt safety without injuring or endangering people? Like, we're just not going to do it. So there's no great way to accurately isolate the data that shows the impact of compensatory revenue. Therefore, the committee or the task force is recommending that this be a line item in your CACR report and on your CACR committee. So basically, you would share with your community and your CACR committee or World Swiss Workforce where the money is going and how the district is spending the compensatory money, and letting your community weigh in that way and being transparent in that way. But there's no possible way to measure accurately the impacts of compensatory revenue.
Yeah, I saw that
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, I saw that they found that and when in the report that the legislative auditor did. And I just wonder, and I'm not being, you know, facetious in any way, but I wonder if we could use that same approach when we are looking at other things that we're evaluating, and how we can, in terms of just being more creative about how we approach evaluation and what we're looking at to see. Because one of the things that I've read in research about this was that it's an awful lot of money that the state and the governments invest in this, but to not know the effectiveness is like, what investor would do something like that. And so I don't know. That's where I was seeking the clarification. So thank you so much for that.
Well, I thank everybody for your questions and for attending. If you're familiar with the MASA mission statement, I'm a very mission-driven leader. So part of our mission statement talks about that MASA members will be the leading voice for public education, shaping and influencing the state and national education agenda. And I think that you saw that our members were doing that. And so I want to highlight that mission-driven work that we're doing. This also impacts things like our equity statement and our belief statements, and we're using those as we drive work forward on responding to the circumstances that are presented to us through these changes. So I want to thank all of our panelists today. Let's give them one more virtual round of applause. Again, if you have further questions about this, please make sure that you send them to Lori Zimmerman and we can work with the panelists to create an FAQ that will be helpful to our members. So I know everyone is in full gear. Some of you have started school, some of you are getting ready to start school. So thanks to taking some time to be with us today. I wish you all a great and restful weekend and a great start to your school year. Take care.